For centuries, everyone believed the same thing about the Amazon rainforest, that it was pure, untouched wilderness. A green ocean too hostile, too poor in nutrients, too dangerous for any large, complex society to ever take root. Explorers who claimed to have seen cities in the jungle were dismissed as fantasists. Historians drew a hard line between the civilized world of stone temples and paved roads, and the Amazon, which was treated as empty, timeless, and essentially untouched by human hands. That assumption shaped textbooks, documentaries, and popular imagination for more than 100 years. That assumption has just collapsed. Buried beneath the forest canopy of lowland Bolivia, in the region known as the Llanos de Mojos, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a sophisticated network of cities built by a civilization known as the Casarabe culture. These were not scattered huts or small forest camps. They were planned urban centers, connected by causeways and canals, defended by earthen platforms, and crowned by pyramids more than 20 meters tall. And they did not look anything like the cities we are used to imagining. There were no dense blocks of stone buildings packed shoulder to shoulder. Instead, the Casarabe built something closer to a garden city, urban cores threaded through with farmland, lagoons and forest, spread across the landscape in a way that let people live at genuinely large scale without stripping the land bare. This is the story of that lost urban civilization, how it was found, how it worked, why it looked so different from anything else in the ancient world, and why the discovery is now forcing historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about cities, about the Amazon, and about what civilization is even supposed to look like, finding a city you cannot see. The story of this discovery starts not with a shovel, but with a laser. For decades, the biggest obstacle to understanding what lies beneath the Amazon canopy has been the canopy itself. Even when researchers suspected that earthworks or settlements might exist under the trees, walking through dense, swampy, biting insect-infested forest to find and map them by hand was slow, exhausting, and often simply impossible. Entire cities could sit 20 meters from a research trail and remain completely invisible. The technology that changed everything is called LIDAR, short for light detection and ranging. A plane or drone flies over the forest, firing thousands of laser pulses per second toward the ground. Most of those pulses bounce off leaves and branches, but a fraction slip through gaps in the canopy and hit the actual earth below. By measuring the time it takes each pulse to return, researchers can build an extremely precise three-dimensional map of the ground surface, with the vegetation digitally stripped away. It is, in effect, X-ray vision for the rainforest. When researchers pointed this technology at the Llanos de Mojos, the results were staggering. What emerged from beneath the digital canopy was not a chaotic scatter of ancient mounds. It was an organized, deliberate landscape. Raised platforms arranged in careful geometric patterns, massive stepped pyramids, moats and defensive ditches, and long, straight lines cutting across the terrain that turned out to be causeways and canals. The scale was the real shock. This was not one hidden village. It was an entire regional network of cities and towns, tied together by infrastructure, spread across hundreds of square kilometers. At the heart of that network sat two major urban centers, now known by the modern names Cotoca and Landivar, surrounded by dozens of smaller settlements linked into the system, like satellite towns around a metropolis. Radiocarbon dating placed the construction and habitation of these sites between roughly 500 and 1400 CE, meaning this civilization was thriving for the better part of 1,000 years. Right through the period when, according to the old assumptions, nothing of the sort was supposed to exist in the Amazon at all. Rewriting what Amazon was supposed to mean to understand why this discovery matters so much. You have to understand just how deeply the old assumption was baked into scientific thinking. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory among archaeologists was that the soils of the Amazon basin were too poor, too acidic and too quickly leached of nutrients by heavy rainfall to support intensive agriculture. Without reliable, large-scale food production, the logic went, you could not support dense populations. Without dense populations, you could not get the specialized labor, the social hierarchy, or the organizational capacity needed to build monumental architecture or manage large infrastructure projects. The Amazon, in this view, was a counterfeit paradise, lush and beautiful to look at, but essentially incapable of sustaining anything beyond small, mobile groups of hunter-gatherers and shifting cultivators. That theory was not just an academic footnote. It shaped how governments and companies talked about the Amazon for generations, framing it as an empty frontier waiting to be developed, rather than a landscape that had already been shaped, farmed, and built upon by millions of people for thousands of years. The Casarabe discovery adds to a growing body of evidence that this picture was simply wrong. Other researchers had already found signs of large pre-Columbian populations elsewhere in the Amazon, including anthropogenic dark earth soils enriched by centuries of human activity, and geometric earthworks in the Brazilian state of Acre. But the Llanos de Mojos sites are among the clearest, most extensive examples yet of true urbanism in the Amazon, not just settlements, but interconnected cities with monumental centers, engineered water systems, and a built environment that reflects centralized planning over a very long period of time. In other words, the Amazon was never empty. It was, at least in this corner of Bolivia, home to one of the more inventive urban experiments in human history. It's also worth understanding why this theory held on for so long, because it wasn't pure stubbornness. Early European explorers who traveled up the Amazon in the 16th century did report seeing large settlements along the riverbanks, dense populations, and organized societies. But those same explorers also unknowingly carried diseases that devastated indigenous populations decades before later expeditions arrived to document what remained. By the time more systematic exploration and colonization took place, the societies those first travelers described had already collapsed, leaving behind a much sparser, more scattered population that seemed to confirm the idea that the Amazon had always been thinly populated. The forest, meanwhile, was busy doing what it does best, reclaiming abandoned fields, swallowing earthworks, and erasing the visible evidence of what had once stood there. Later scholars, working from that diminished baseline and without the tools to see beneath the canopy, drew the wrong conclusion, not out of carelessness, but because the physical evidence needed to know better was, quite literally, invisible to them. That is precisely what makes modern remote sensing so revolutionary. It is not just a convenience that speeds up survey work. It is fundamentally changing what counts as evidence in Amazonian archaeology, revealing a past that was always there, just permanently out of sight. Who were the Casarabe people? So who actually built all of this? The people we now call the Casarabe culture, named after the archaeological site where their distinctive pottery and settlement pattern were first identified, lived in the seasonally flooded savannas and forest islands of the Llanos de Mojos in what is now the Bolivian department of Beni. This is a landscape defined by extremes, a long dry season followed by months of heavy rain that can turn huge stretches of the plains into shallow lakes. Any group hoping to live here permanently, let alone build cities, had to find a way to manage that flood-drought cycle rather than simply endure it. The Casarabe culture emerged around 500 CE and continued developing and expanding for roughly 900 years, reaching its peak sometime between 700 and 1400 CE. During that time, the population organized itself into a clear settlement hierarchy. At the top were large primary centers like Cotoca and Landivar, distinguished by monumental stepped pyramids, extensive plaza complexes, concentric ditches and embankments, and dense clusters of residential platforms. Below those sat secondary and tertiary settlements of decreasing size, scattered across the landscape but tied directly into the central places through raised roads and canals. This is one of the details that excites archaeologists the most. The settlements were not just similar to each other by coincidence. They were physically and functionally connected in a way that suggests real political and economic integration across a wide region. Goods, people, water, and probably ideas and authority all moved along these built connections. That is not the profile of scattered independent villages. It is the profile of an interconnected urban and political system, even if it doesn't look anything like the walled cities of Mesopotamia or the stone plazas of the Maya lowlands. A garden city 1,000 years ahead of its name, which brings us to the single strangest, most striking feature of Casarabe urbanism, what researchers now describe as low-density urbanism, or more evocatively, a garden city model. When most people picture an ancient city, they picture density. Tightly packed houses, narrow streets, thousands of people crammed into a small footprint, because that is how cities worked in Rome, in Tenochtitlan, in medieval Europe. Density was, for most of human history, simply what urban life looked like. Because building outward instead of upward or inward required enormous amounts of land, labor, and infrastructure that most societies could not spare. The Casarabe cities inverted that logic. Instead of concentrating people into tightly packed cores, the population was spread across a much larger footprint, interwoven with cultivated fields, managed forest patches, and open water. Monumental centers with their pyramids and plazas were real focal points of political and religious life, but the majority of people did not live crammed against those monuments. They lived spread out around them, in a landscape that mixed built structures with productive land, in much the same way that modern garden city planning, developed in Europe in the early 20th century, tried to blend residential neighborhoods with green space and small-scale agriculture. The difference is that the Casarabe were doing this 1,000 years earlier, apparently by necessity as much as by design. Living in a seasonally flooded environment meant that you could not simply build a compact city on flat ground and hope for the best. You needed to elevate key structures, manage water flow across a wide area, and keep enough productive land close at hand to feed a large, dispersed population. Low-density urbanism was not primitive or accidental. It was an adaptive strategy, a way of achieving genuine urban scale and complexity while working with the rhythms of a floodplain instead of fighting them. This matters far beyond archaeology. It is direct physical evidence that city does not have to mean dense, walled and paved. It can mean an integrated, engineered landscape where farmland, forest and settlement coexist by design, something contemporary urban planners are still trying to figure out how to do at scale in the 21st century. Pyramids rising from the floodplain. None of this should be mistaken for modesty in ambition, though. At the core of the largest Casarabe settlements stood genuinely monumental architecture. The most striking of these structures are stepped earthen pyramids, some reaching heights of around 22 meters, roughly the height of a 7-story building. These were not built from cut stone blocks like the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of the Maya. They were built from earth, compacted, layered, and shaped over time. An enormous undertaking that required organizing labor, managing materials, and maintaining a shared architectural vision across generations. Around these central pyramids, researchers have identified elevated residential and ceremonial platforms, open plazas likely used for public gatherings or ritual events, and concentric rings of ditches and earthen embankments encircling the monumental core. These concentric rings are especially interesting because they suggest a layered spatial organization, with the most important structures at the center and progressively less monumental construction as you move outward. A pattern that mirrors in a very different material and style The kind of hierarchical city planning seen in far better-known ancient civilizations. All of this was built without draft animals, without metal tools, and without the wheel used for heavy transport, in one of the most physically demanding environments on the planet to construct anything permanent in. Every basket of earth moved to raise a platform or shape a pyramid represented real human effort, coordinated at a scale that implies organized labor, shared purpose, and some form of centralized planning or authority capable of directing that effort over long periods of time. The engineering feat hiding in plain sight. The 7-kilometer canal, as impressive as the pyramids are. The single detail that tends to stop people in their tracks is something far less visually dramatic on the surface, but arguably more revealing about the sophistication of Casarabe society, water engineering. Linked to the urban core of Cotoca, researchers identified an artificial canal stretching roughly 7 kilometers, engineered to carry water from a natural lagoon directly to the city. Think about what that actually requires. You cannot dig a 7-kilometer channel by guesswork. You need to understand the subtle slope of the land well enough to keep water flowing in the direction you want, rather than pooling uselessly or draining away in the wrong direction. You need a workforce large enough and organized enough to excavate, shape and reinforce that channel, likely over an extended period of construction. And you need some form of long-term planning and maintenance, because a canal like that does not stay functional on its own. It silts up, its banks erode, and it needs continual upkeep across generations to remain useful. This was not an isolated stunt of engineering. It was part of a much broader system of water management spread across the region. Canals connecting settlements to lagoons and rivers, reservoirs for storing water through the dry season, and drainage features designed to move excess water away from settlements during the flood season. Together, these features suggest that the Casarabe were not simply coping with the extreme wet-dry cycle of the Llanos de Mojos. They were actively managing it, turning a landscape that alternated between flood and drought into something closer to a controlled, productive system. That kind of hydraulic engineering is the signature of what archaeologists sometimes call a hydraulic civilization, a society whose scale and organization are closely tied to the collective management of water. It places the Casarabe in the same broad conversation as far more famous examples of large-scale water engineering in the ancient world, even though almost nobody outside specialist circles had heard of them until very recently. It's important to be honest about the scientific process here, too. Not every researcher agrees on every detail of how these canals functioned. How much of the water system was built all at once versus expanded gradually over centuries, or exactly how large the population supported by this infrastructure really was. Some specialists urge caution about overstating population figures based on limited excavation, while others argue the visible scale of the earthworks implies a labor force large enough to imply thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of people spread across the settlement network at its peak. That kind of debate is not a weakness in the discovery. It is simply how good science works. Nobody is claiming to have the final word on the Casarabe. What the LIDAR survey and subsequent excavations have done is establish, beyond reasonable doubt, that organized water engineering on this scale existed, and that alone is enough to overturn decades of assumptions about what the Amazon was and was not capable of producing. Roads that rise above the floodwater management alone would not have been enough to hold this civilization together, though. The Casarabe also needed a way to move people and goods across a landscape that spent part of the year underwater. Their solution was the raised causeway. These causeways, sometimes referred to by the more evocative Spanish term calzadas, were elevated earthen roads connecting settlements to one another and to their surrounding agricultural land. By building these paths above the seasonal floodwaters, the Casarabe ensured that travel, trade, and communication between communities could continue even during the wettest months, when much of the surrounding savanna would otherwise become impassable. This causeway network is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for genuine regional integration. Individual settlements were not isolated islands of habitation scattered randomly across the plains. They were nodes in a connected system, physically linked by infrastructure that had to be planned, built, and maintained collectively. Combined with the canals, the causeways turned an unpredictable, seasonally hostile landscape into something navigable and productive year-round, effectively engineering reliability into an environment that offered none by default. Feeding a civilization without stripping the land infrastructure on this scale does not exist to move nothing. Behind the canals, causeways, and monumental centers of the Casarabe was an agricultural system sophisticated enough to feed a large, spread-out population season after season. For close to 1,000 years, researchers have identified evidence of raised agricultural fields, elevated above the floodline to keep crops safe during the wet season, along with managed fish ponds and water control features that likely supported aquaculture as a complementary food source. Rather than relying on a single strategy, the Casarabe appear to have combined multiple approaches: cultivated fields, managed forest resources, and aquatic food sources, spread across a landscape that mixed built environment with productive land in a genuinely deliberate way. This is part of what makes the Garden City description so fitting. The fields, forest patches, and water features were not just background scenery around the urban core. They were functionally integrated into it, positioned within reach of the population that depended on them. Instead of concentrating agricultural production far outside the city and shipping food inward, the Casarabe appear to have kept much of their productive landscape close to where people actually lived, reducing the need for long-distance transport and keeping the whole system more resilient to disruption. It's worth pausing on just how different this is from the pattern of environmental degradation we associate with rapid urban growth today. Building at genuine urban scale over centuries in a fragile floodplain ecosystem without collapsing the very environment that sustained the population is not a small achievement. It suggests a society that had learned, through trial and adaptation over many generations, how to grow without simply extracting everything the land had to offer. Life inside the network, what would it actually have felt like to live in one of these communities? Picture a landscape where the horizon is punctuated not by skyscrapers, but by long, low earthen platforms, and near the largest centers, a stepped pyramid rising above the tree line. Raised causeways stretch out from the settlement like spokes, connecting it to neighboring communities and outlying fields. During the dry season, canals and reservoirs hold water close at hand for drinking, cooking, and irrigation. During the wet season, those same waterways swell, and the causeways become the only reliable dry paths across a landscape transformed into shallow lake. Daily life would have moved to the rhythm of that flood-drought cycle. Planting and harvesting timed to the seasons. Fishing intensified when the waters rose. Construction and maintenance work concentrated in the drier months when moving earth and materials was easier. Political and religious life likely centered on the monumental cores, where public plazas and pyramids provided space for gatherings, ceremonies, and the kind of shared rituals that help hold a dispersed population together as a single community, rather than a loose collection of separate villages. The pottery, tools, and other material remains recovered from Casarabe sites point to a society with specialized craft production, long-distance exchange of goods, and social differentiation, meaning some individuals or families likely held more authority, resources, or status than others. None of this looks like a simple egalitarian scattering of subsistence farmers. It looks like a functioning, layered society with its own internal politics and hierarchy, expressed through architecture and settlement. pattern rather than through the kind of stone, monuments that tend to dominate our mental image of advanced ancient civilizations, the distinctive pottery style that gives the culture its name is itself a clue to how connected this society was. Similar ceramic styles, decorative motifs, and construction techniques appear across dozens of sites throughout the region, which tells researchers that this was not a case of isolated communities independently arriving at similar solutions. It was a shared cultural tradition, likely spread and reinforced through the same networks of causeways and canals that moved water, food, and people. A distinctive style of pottery showing up consistently across 100 kilometers of settlements is the archaeological equivalent of a shared language or a shared set of customs, a sign that these communities saw themselves at some level as part of the same broader world. There is also the question of who held authority in this dispersed urban system. The presence of massive pyramids and plazas at only a handful of primary centers versus much smaller platforms at secondary and tertiary settlements strongly suggests some form of centralized political or religious leadership based at those major hubs, capable of mobilizing labor from a wide surrounding population for large communal projects like pyramid construction or canal maintenance. Whether that authority took the form of a single ruling lineage, a council of elite families, or some other arrangement entirely is still an open question, and probably will remain one for a long time. Since the Casarabe left no written records behind, only the shape of the land itself to tell their story, not the only lost city, but a different kind of lost city, it is worth placing the Casarabe alongside some of the more famous names in the history of monumental architecture, not to rank them, but to highlight just how different their solution to the problem of how do we build a city really was. The stone pyramids of the Maya lowlands, the sprawling temple city of Angkor in Cambodia, the terraced agricultural cities of the Inca in the Andes. Each of these represents a distinct answer to the challenge of supporting large populations, coordinating labor, and expressing political and religious authority through the built environment. Angkor, in particular, offers an interesting parallel, since it too was a low-density, spread-out urban settlement laced with an elaborate water management system of reservoirs and canals, uncovered in detail only relatively recently through, again, LIDAR survey. The Casarabe cities belong in that same conversation, not as a lesser or more primitive version of real urbanism, but as a genuinely distinct model, adapted specifically to a seasonally flooded tropical floodplain using earth, water, and organized labor rather than quarried stone. That the technology used to reveal both Angkor's hidden extent and the Casarabe cities was the same laser-based, remote sensing method is a small but telling reminder of how much of human urban history has simply been sitting there, invisible, waiting for the right tool to bring it into view. What happened to them? Like many pre-Columbian societies across the Americas, the Casarabe culture appears to have gone into decline before European contact reshaped the continent. Evidence suggests activity at the major centers tapered off sometime around 1400 CE, a few centuries before Spanish colonization began altering the demographic and ecological landscape of South America more broadly. The precise causes of that decline remain uncertain, and this is very much an active area of ongoing research rather than a settled conclusion. Climate shifts affecting the delicate flood-drought balance the Casarabe had learned to manage. Changes in regional trade and political relationships, internal social transformation, or some combination of these factors are all plausible contributors. What is clear is that once the intensive labor-dependent maintenance of canals, causeways and raised fields stopped, the forest did what the forest does. It grew back over everything, patiently reclaiming pyramids, plazas and waterways until, from the ground, there was nothing left to suggest that a thriving urban civilization had ever stood there at all. That is, until a laser flying overhead saw straight through the leaves. Why this discovery matters right now. It would be easy to treat this as simply a fascinating historical curiosity, and it certainly is that. But the Casarabe discovery lands at a moment when its implications reach well beyond archaeology. For years, public conversation about the Amazon has often framed the choice as a stark binary. Either leave the rainforest as untouched wilderness, or develop it, typically through deforestation, agriculture and extraction at real ecological cost. The Casarabe cities complicate that binary in a genuinely useful way. Here is direct physical evidence that dense human settlement, agriculture, monumental architecture, and long-distance infrastructure could exist in the Amazon for centuries without wiping out the surrounding ecosystem. The Casarabe were not simply surviving inside the forest. In many ways, they were actively shaping it, managing water and land at landscape scale, while apparently maintaining a level of ecological balance that allowed both people and forest to persist together for the better part of a millennium. That does not mean their exact methods can simply be copied and applied to modern development challenges. The scale, technology, and social organization of the 21st century are obviously very different from those of the 8th or 10th century. But it does mean that some of the sharpest thinking about how to combine human settlement with ecological sustainability may already have been worked out once before on this very continent by people history had almost completely erased from memory until a laser beam brought their cities back into view. And this may genuinely be just the beginning. Researchers working with LIDAR data across the wider Amazon basin have already flagged dozens of additional sites that show signs of similar engineered landscapes, still unexcavated, still hidden beneath the canopy. Every one of those sites is a potential answer to questions we did not even know we should be asking. How many people actually lived in the Amazon before European contact? How widespread was this kind of low-density urban planning? And how many other empty landscapes around the world are, in fact, exactly the opposite? There is also something quietly humbling in all of this. For most of the last century, the story of human progress was told almost entirely through a handful of familiar civilizations. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, China, the Maya, the Inca. Those societies earned their place in that story because they left behind stone, writing, and ruins that were hard to miss. The Casarabe left behind earth, wood, and water systems, materials that decay, erode, and disappear back into the landscape far more easily than carved granite or fired brick. Their absence from the history books for so long says less about what they achieved and more about what kinds of achievement history has historically been equipped to notice. A civilization built from more perishable materials is not a lesser civilization. It is simply a civilization that needed a very particular kind of tool, arriving a very particular number of centuries later, before the rest of the world could finally see what had been there all along. That should change how we think about empty landscapes more broadly, not just in the Amazon, but in floodplains, wetlands, and forests all over the world, where similar assumptions have quietly gone unquestioned for generations. Every one of those landscapes is a place where the absence of stone ruins has too often been mistaken for the absence of history. The Llanos de Mojos suggests that mistake can run for a very long time, until the right technology, the right question, or the right stubborn researcher finally comes along to correct it. For now, the forest has closed back over the canals and causeways of Cotoca and Landiva, just as it did centuries ago, and life in the region goes on largely without reference to the empire that once organized its water and its harvests. But somewhere above that same canopy, more laser surveys are already being planned. More data is already being processed, and more geometric shadows are almost certainly waiting to resolve into pyramids, plazas, and roads on someone's screen. Every one of those future discoveries carries the same quiet lesson this one does: the story of who built cities who mastered water, and who shaped the land long before anyone was writing it down, is nowhere near finished being told. So the next time you see a stretch of dense, seemingly untouched forest, it might be worth asking a different question than the one people have been asking for the last 100 years. Not what is hidden in this jungle, but what city might already be lying beneath it, waiting for someone to finally look. If this blew your mind the way it blew mine, hit that like button. It really helps this channel keep bringing you stories like this one. Subscribe if you want more hidden history, lost civilizations, and discoveries that rewrite the textbooks. And let me know in the comments, how many more lost cities do you think are still hiding under the Amazon, waiting to be found?